to independently research what companies are actually doing, because we also realize that there's still so much we don't know. And it makes it quite easy for tech platforms to say, well, the public debate is off, the media don't cover this correctly, and also public policy is incorrect. Well, help us help you, in the sense that if there's no transparency, then it's really hard to make evidence-based recommendations. And I hear the same complaints from my colleagues at Stanford, that they wish they could do more rigorous research, but we're really scratching the surface. Regulators face the same problem. And because there's a lack of transparency, there's a lack of accountability. And so throughout the report, you'll see some more detailed recommendations of how we might get to a better place, to start having a better grip on what is happening, and at the end of the day, have a sort of a guarantee for more trust in the measures that are taken, so that democracy is not eroded, so that we are collectively in a better position vis-a-vis authoritarian regimes. And I feel like the whole discussion about boycotting by advertisers, Black Lives Matter, questions of racism and hate that go on these platforms has almost put as strong as possible a spotlight as we could imagine on the discussion that we've had. And so I hope that this will be the start of a broader societal discussion, a moment where even though politics are difficult, Americans and Europeans can find each other and look for a broader democratic coalition, because I think if we lose each other in this process, and the risk is real, then again, democracy will suffer, freedom of expression will suffer, human rights will suffer, transparency and accountability will suffer. And so I'll leave it at that as an introduction to a little bit of an impression of our 2-year process, which was heated, but which also led to some shared points on the horizon that hopefully we can build upon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly powerful. And I apologize, I seem to have a weak internet connection. So if I lose you, I'm going to ask Susan to maybe take over the moderating role, and I'll try not to let my internet connection spoil this really rich discussion. Susan, I wanted to turn to you though. You lay out a flexible regulatory framework in the paper, and Marietje just set out the values, the problem, and I wonder if you could just talk specifically about this flexible regulatory framework. How is it different? You know, what would really be different from the current self-regulatory system, especially in light of the ad boycott and all the impact it's having? And how would it solve some of the problems that we're seeing?
Thank you, Karen. And I also want to thank the German Marshall Fund for hosting this today. I also do want to mention that the project is a project of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at Penn in cooperation with the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands and the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in the United States. We are greatly appreciative of all of it. It is also very much of a transatlantic group. My European, excuse me, think tank partner is Xavier, which is a part of the University of Amsterdam. Marietje is my European co-chair, and our funding came from both European and US sources, non-corporate. So with that, a little bit as my commercial introduction, the regulation on the basis of transparency, our flexible framework, is transparency by social media companies. First of all, it's not an end unto itself, but it enables governments to develop evidence-based policies for oversight of the tech companies. As Marietje also said, it pushes firms to examine problems that they would not otherwise choose to address, and it empowers citizens, all three of which are powerful for sanitizing, if you will, the information ecosystem. But it's got to be accompanied by accountability. Law enforcement, too, I would underscore, has an obligation to be transparent and not to deputize platforms to remove content without due process. So we also did have recommendation on that score. It establishes an accountability regime to hold platforms to their promises. A flexible transparency framework should be supervised by a regulator or an oversight auditor with the power to set baseline standards, require effective ways for users to seek redress for moderation problems, and potentially to sanction repeated failures. The supervisory body, once again, this is flexible. It could be a government agency, either new or existing. It could be an industry association like FINRA in the United States, which regulates stockbrokers, or it could be a multi-stakeholder group. We recommended creating a multi-tiered disclosure structure. This would offer broader access to information on different tiers for users, for researchers, which is a key, again, to developing the evidence-based rules, and for regulators to inform them of policies. It provides for efficient and effective redress mechanisms. We discussed, but did not get into a huge amount of detail on two complementary systems that we encourage people going forward to look at. One was social media councils, the other were e-courts. Briefly, social media councils are strictly independent external oversight bodies. That is not the case with the Facebook oversight commission that it is established. But these strictly independent external oversight bodies can make consequential policy recommendations. They can set moderation standards, or they could be used to decide appeals for moderation decisions. And then also very creatively, an e-court system, which could be staffed by specially trained judicial magistrates, would adjudicate online cases involving potential violations of free expression and human rights. So both of these concepts are worthy of further development. Finally, we recommended using an ABC approach to combat viral deception or disinformation. That means distinguishing between bad actors, deceptive behavior, and harmful content. It is much more effective to address artificial behavior on the internet that creates viral reach, rather than focusing just on the content itself. States have other tools such as diplomacy and sanctions when there's foreign interference. And Laura Rosenberg, our colleague who's affiliated with GMF, is an expert in that area and served on our working group as well. So a flexible framework of transparency with accountability, accompanied by effective redress systems, will go a long way towards restoring trust among government, online providers, and the public. And why is trust important? Because if you have a we-they situation, if it's always adversarial and not cooperative, we're not going to be able to solve the problems going forward with bad actors who are very good at mutating their approach so that they can disseminate their viral issues, venomous messages, without being able to be detected. And that is happening so rapidly. These changes online are happening so rapidly that it really will take a combination of players to address the situation and make our public safer for democracy. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Susan. Reading your work, very much like the law in terms of free expression, and we talk some more about that and how important that is globally. And then also, if you Marietje,
Karen, we're losing your audio.
oh dear, can you hear it all? Okay, David, I think you know what I want to ask. I'm going to go off and get on again.
That sounds great. Thanks so much, Karen. I think I do know what you were going to ask. And I want to just start by first thanking Susan Ness for really, because I'm not sure how clear this was, she really pulled this all together. The entire Transatlantic Working Group would not have taken place without Susan's just dedication to making it happen. I think it must have been about 2 years ago that I got a call from Susan saying she wanted to do this, and she really made it happen. I think what I want to underscore are a couple of things, starting from the premise that Marietje started with, which is the central importance of protecting democratic foundations. And democratic foundations, and this was the shared value, even though people within the working group, I think, came at these issues from different perspectives, you know, from the perspective of countering disinformation or countering terrorist content or hate speech. Notwithstanding the different places that people came from, I think the foundational point was that social media and, you know, online content more generally needs to serve democratic foundations and not work against it. And so we need to find ways to ensure that that happens. And so with that foundation, I think that we all did, despite, you know, some of our differences, I think it was, generally speaking, a working group that was moving in the same direction. And what I want to do is underline a few of the proposals and conclusions that Susan identified, really just to highlight how important they are, in part because the proposals, you know, in a policy report may just seem as if, well, these are just some ideas that we have, and they may look, you know, even middle of the road. But I think some of them are actually quite important, and even if implemented would be quite groundbreaking. So the first one is on transparency. Obviously, there's a lot of talk around transparency, generally speaking, and transparency can be kind of a kind of contentless mantra if we don't put teeth into it. And I think that the underlying idea of the transparency proposals in the TWG report is that it is practically impossible to address, you know, the ills that people see from online content if we're not at the same level as the companies in understanding what's happening on the platforms. And so transparency is absolutely crucial. But what the report is suggesting is not merely what much, you know, frankly, much of the discussion and policy has focused on over time, which is, you know, laws that require the companies to be transparent. But the report actually proposes something which I think would be groundbreaking, which would be a real, as Susan was discussing it, a real mechanism to ensure that kind of transparency. You know, we have these mechanisms for transparency in other areas, particularly securities, as an example. And these are massive companies. It's a massive industry with significant impact on society. And that kind of baseline transparency that is supported by regulatory action, I think is something that people should really be paying attention to here, because it really goes beyond the mantra and gives some concrete ideas. A second area where I think the report really gets into some important proposals that I think could be lost if we think of them as just, you know, ideas that are standard, are the two ideas around accountability, and that is the social media councils and the idea of e-courts. I think one of the things that we've seen over the last, you know, 5 to 7 years, as in particular as European institutions, whether it's the European Commission or it's national institutions, such as in Germany, the adoption of NetzDG, or other mechanisms that have been proposed around Europe. One of the things that we have seen is the adoption of legal mechanisms or even recommending mechanisms that, that actually reinforce the power of the companies over, the space that they're occupying, because they're basically saying, here we've got, we think you need to observe our law, and now go ahead and do it. What the report suggests is there needs to be something more fundamentally democratic about dealing with content. And one idea is this kind of cross-industry accountability mechanism, the social media councils, which we could talk more about as we go forward. The other is this idea of e-courts. And both of these ideas are moving in the same direction, which is there really needs to be a fundamental decision by national and supranational institutions, and also by multi-stakeholder organizations and multi-stakeholder gatherings to really impose a kind of accountability around this space. So it's not just about saying, here are the rules and you need to apply them, because only the wealthiest companies can really do that. It's creating the democratic mechanisms for making that happen. And then finally, I think the last points on this approach to disinformation are really important. You know, so often we see the discussion around disinformation as being a kind of amorphic thing where we think, you know, this kind of information is bad and it needs to be addressed. The report really does provide a framework for thinking about, you know, actors and behavior that I think will allow not only the companies, but also governments and other institutions to really address disinformation. And that means, you know, viral deception is the way the report talks about it, to address it in a concrete way. So I think like all of these different aspects of the report, I think in a way that maybe we've almost understated, really move this discussion forward. And my hope is that it can be a real foundation for a conversation, you know, both within Europe and within the United States and in the transatlantic setting.
David, could you talk more about the social media councils that you just talked about, and maybe underscore when you say that this brings a democratic process and democratic accountability? I always get a little confused about that, because we elect our governments, these multi-stakeholder groups, even if they're representative, somebody's choosing the members, some people have more money to participate, they're not democratically elected. Can you tease out those issues a little bit?
Sure, it's a really good point. So first off, when we're talking about social media councils, what we really are talking about, and the report gets into this, you know, we're talking about multi-stakeholder oversight that is cross-industry. So to give it, maybe to focus it a little bit more, I think many of the participants will be familiar with the Facebook Oversight Board that was recently announced. It recently, or last month, announced its first 20 members, its first 20 panelists. So that's a self-regulatory mechanism, right? That is only Facebook taking appeals for the hardest questions, basically, and this outside or independent but Facebook-funded and Facebook-created organization evaluating these hard questions. The idea of a social media council is that we abstract that idea out and make that kind of independent oversight across the industry. It's true. I mean, the idea of a social media council is not that they would be necessarily government chartered. So they wouldn't be the result of a government process of creating these institutions. The idea would be much more that there would be sort of across different stakeholders, and I agree, Karen, these aren't necessarily, they're not elected individuals, but across different stakeholders, you have the interest brought to bear in these social media councils so that at least the hardest questions can be addressed not just by the companies and not just by governments, but by others, particularly users who typically don't have a voice, or activists who don't have a voice in these kinds of decisions. But I do want to emphasize, and I think the report makes this clear as well, that social media councils are not, you know, the final word in all of this. they are a mechanism for, I think, encouraging the companies to meet their human rights obligations, their human rights responsibilities under such instruments as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So it's a tool to encourage that. It's also a tool to encourage better transparency, but it's not a substitute. And social media councils cannot be a substitute for, real democratic oversight, whether it's the transparency mechanisms that the report is talking about, or it's something like the e-courts mechanism, which would be something in which, real democratic institutions, that is judiciaries, and we need to think creatively about this, and this is one of the failures, frankly, of governments over the last 10 years, is that there hasn't been a creative thinking about how to involve democratic institutions in all of this work, that if we have that kind of mechanism in addition to social media councils, then you could, then you bring in that democratic oversight and the democratic foundations.
That's incredibly useful. Susan, I want to go back to your experience at the FCC, and you talked about a supervisory body, and you also, you said that it's flexible. It could be a new entity, it could be an existing entity. I'm very interested in how that plays with what David just said. What is the role for the government supervisory body in terms of transparency and accountability, in addition to this dialogue and multi-stakeholder process that David was just talking about, and the e-courts?
Okay, my experience, first of all, as an FCC commissioner, is very often you have what's called the Law of Unintended Consequences. It's the failure, you're looking backwards to draft rules. It takes a number of years to get those rules on the books. And consequently, oftentimes you're failed to grasp what's ahead of the game. And it's often an adversarial process. It can be gamed very easily by companies against their competitors and the like. What we're trying to create would be a more cooperative process where people can come together to solve those problems, including with the public participation. So what we are suggesting, it would be presumably legislation would set up this framework. And then within that, you could have, as we talked about, a government agency that would oversee the transparency of the companies. Are they meeting what they say they are doing? Are they enforcing their own rules? Secondly, it could be an entity that would be empowered by the legislation to provide that accountability through audits or otherwise. Well, the basis for this concept actually came from an experiment that was done in France with Facebook, in which a number of different government agencies were embedded within Facebook for a period of time. That experiment did not succeed that well, but what it did do is to inform government as to what information they needed to have and where that information resided, how you get there. And that's what the accountability would do. For example, as David was mentioning, you have auditors, accounting firms that audit firms for the rules that have been set up by the Securities and Exchange Commission on their financial situation. Similar type audits could be done through private entities to ensure that the transparency is being fulfilled. But from my experience as a commissioner, the role of government is a very delicate one, particularly when it comes to addressing free speech. We need to be very cautious about using the power of government to determine what is permitted and what is not permitted. It can be power can be abused, as we're seeing in a number of countries around the world. So those are some of the reactions that I had just simply from having been in a regulatory seat previously. If there is regulation, our group, first of all, did not address, I want to point this out, we did not address privacy. Privacy rules complement everything that we're doing. And I hope that we will have privacy in the United States. And then
I want to try to get Marietje in here on that topic, because I know in Europe, these are really live issues. We've got the consultation going on about the Digital Services Act. Competition is bleeding into the privacy issue because it's seen that data is a competitive advantage. There's a whole separate effort that's going on in disinformation. And I would love your thoughts about how the discussions that are going on there could be influenced, could be, what would, given what the recommendations are, what would you advise, or are you telling your European colleagues about how some of these processes should develop?
Yeah, so I wanted to pick up on two things that were said earlier, because I think it's important to note. I mean, a lot of what we're discussing is about power, and there's a tendency to shine a bright spotlight of scrutiny on every legislative proposal, as we should. I mean, that's healthy in a democracy, but there's not as much scrutiny of the power that the companies already have over content moderation and things like that. So I think if we look at who has power and where checks and balances should come from, that's an important thing to recognize. And second, unnoticed, the checks and balances over governments in democracies is fundamentally different than that in authoritarian regimes. And for example, if we look in Europe, the tradition of regulating for pluralism, for a media landscape, for freedom of expression, does not mean that government is going to say what can be said and what cannot be said. It may regulate for a few very, very clear exemptions, but generally it also regulates for the space of freedom. And I think it's helpful to think about it that way, that regulations are not always restricting or dictating or whatnot, especially when they're coming out of democracies. Now, in Europe, you're right, you see a wide variety of legislative proposals. And I would say they come from a core need and desire to apply more oversight to the role of the private sector. And this steps beyond the notion of a market or abuse of market power in the case of antitrust, or privacy as a consumer right as it is known in the United States. It really touches on the notion that a lot of these big tech companies and technology more broadly, because we're also looking at AI, it's not only about social media companies. The role of technology is not only impacting the market, it is impacting fundamental rights, and it is impacting the public sphere. And so I think the common thread between proposals in the Digital Single Market Act, in the EU AI white paper, the data strategy, and many of the national proposals as well, you'll see that there's a merging of efforts between making sure there's fairness in the economy and making sure that fundamental rights, human rights, and democracy are preserved. And what I would recommend my former colleagues or current European friends and experts working on this is to make sure that Europe stays true to its values and principles. I think if not Europe, then who? Let's be real about what is happening in the United States and how deeply, deeply harmful it is for the credibility of the United States to play any role of leadership when it comes to preserving democracy. So Europe has to pick up the mantle, but must also make sure that these promises turn into practice and not be too complacent, because there's a tendency in Europe to embrace this notion of being a super regulator. And I think that is never sufficient of a proposition. There has to be economic growth on the basis of values. There has to be a much deeper appreciation in Europe of the geopolitical stakes in this space. So for example, when it comes to AI, there should be more focus on the military use of AI. When it comes to national security concerns, European countries have to work together much more firmly vis-a-vis companies like Huawei or other 5G providers, but also others in the strategic space. And that sort of geopolitical dimension of everything we're talking about risks being lost in Europe if we talk only about fundamental rights, even as I believe they're very important. So no time for complacency, make a distinction between who acts in the interest of democracy and who may not. And to also recognize the urgency of the moment. I hope Americans do, and I know they do, and I hope Europeans do too. And not to forget that there's entirely competing models coming from China and elsewhere that do not even allow for discussions like this to be had between people with different opinions. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I look to Brussels and the capitals of EU countries for leadership in the interest of democracy right now.
It's so interesting to have you as this translator between the European discussion and the US discussion. To your use of the concepts of power and freedom, I think are so valuable in terms of the discussion here. And I love that idea that government doesn't only have to impinge on freedom, but can create space for freedom. That's incredibly valuable. And that's a great segue for David. But before I say that, please, if you have questions, the audience, please submit them, and the panel will be happy to consider them. I'll sift through them and hand them over. But David, I wanted you to, if you could, Marietje just talked about Europe taking the lead, that the U.S. That was a little painful to hear that the U.S. isn't in a position to lead. You know, and you've been in a situation where there have been discussions about norms, discussion about the harms that occur globally. Is there any hope for the US and Europe working together to set forth a framework that could actually work at scale, quote unquote, around the world and prevent, you know, future situations like what happened in Myanmar, what happened in the Philippines, and so on?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I wouldn't focus too much on the possibility of the US and Europe working together to solve this problem. In part, that's because, you know, as they say, the cat's out of the bag. You know, things are happening already right now. And I think what we're seeing in Europe, I mean, to me is actually quite heartening. I mean, what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is, you know, in France, for example, we saw the Constitutional Court issue a decision regarding, you know, the recently adopted French hate speech law that was really tough, but also reinforced fundamental freedom of expression principles, and did so in a way that I think actually is likely to help shape the conversation in Europe. And so I think that the idea that the U.S. at this moment, and maybe even generally speaking, can offer Europe something, you know, kind of different about how to address these kinds of issues, I think is, first of all, it's a little bit arrogant for Americans to suggest that, but it's also just unrealistic in the sense that things are already moving in Europe. And so I think that it's really quite important for there to be a conversation. So things like the Transatlantic Working Group will really sensitize Americans and Europeans to different perspectives across the Atlantic. And that's essential, and also can help identify where those, you know, as I think Susan mentioned, the shared values point to similar kinds of regulatory outcomes. But I don't think we should forget, and certainly the companies shouldn't forget this, but this is especially important for Americans, is that the direction of European regulation, because, Karen, as you mentioned, these are massive companies, and as Marietje mentioned, with massive power, because they operate on principles of scale, the regulatory environment that's created in Europe will almost certainly have an impact on users in the United States, on the regulatory process in the United States. I mean, as we look at Washington, there are a lot of ideas that are pretty terrible around content moderation, and there are some pretty good ones. But I think that there'll be a huge influence from Europe that for Americans is probably a little uncomfortable to acknowledge that we may be influenced by Europe rather than it being the other way around. But that influence will be very concrete, because the companies will ultimately be forced to respond to regulatory moves in Europe that have an impact on users and expression and the problems that we've been talking about for Americans as well.
We've gotten some great questions already. One focuses on this issue of virality and algorithmic promotion, and asks the question about how that would fit into the ABC framework. And I open that to anybody who wants to answer.
I'm happy to just make a few brief observations. I mean, one of the things we didn't get to look at, and I think should be mentioned just because, you know, the clarity would maybe help others focus on that, is things like micro-targeting, data gathering. Yeah. And of course, that's a huge part of the ecosystem of, you know, how to reach people, how to single out minorities, how to share hate speech that may go unnoticed because there's no sort of overview of everything that goes on platforms. So there was a lot of things that we couldn't focus on because we had a mandate to look at freedom of expression, and the more you dig, the more you find. But the ABC framework does offer lenses, if you will, to look at the various aspects of why disinformation is powerful that go beyond content, and also explicitly encourage us to look beyond content. So the notion of ABC that Camille Francois, who was one of the valued participants in this group and who authored a paper on this, came up with, it's a very helpful framework to say, those who share disinformation, sort of who are at the root of sharing disinformation, so not sort of your innocent neighbor who's sharing a message because they think it's outrageous or crazy or shocking. Those who have a strategic agenda of disinformation can be zoomed in on by looking at the actors. So for example, who would be doing this for what goal? Geopolitical goals, commercial goals, religious goals. Two, the behavior. What are they doing? How do we identify what they're showing us? Are they bots? Are they automated? Do they have big capacity, or does it look organic and from an individual human being? What we're seeing, and then only third, the C is content, which I think we've talked more about in this session. So you could say that virality depends at least on the B and the C, a combination of what kind of content is shared by how many people or how many accounts. And if there's an artificial inflation of that, then that could be reason for concern. And I would say that transparency, in the broad sense of the word, must help us understand better what is actually happening, so that if we hear a lot of noise, can we be sure that these are people who have strong opinions, or is it inflated notions of anger by, you know, a couple of actors that are using bots and other inauthentic coordinated behavior to create the impression of a critical mass, an important voice that should be heard through virality, which is one of the most distinct features of social media. So to imply virality is already a powerful move that certain actors might benefit from.
So this question follows right on from that, and I think it's best for David. It says, when addressing disinformation moderation, how do you suggest drawing the line between, and they use this phrase, ideal-driven versions of the truth versus intentional disinformation, what I think Marietje was calling strategic? How do you combat disinformation by those that are intentionally driving discord while protecting freedom of speech of those that are ideal-driven? And I guess this gets at to some extent at the C in the ABC as well.
It's a really great and deep question. It's probably a good subject for an entire other panel as to how we deal with it. But I think one way to think about this is, so the ABC, I agree, you know, content is where this question is heading. And, but I think the ABC framework actually allows us to move to a place that is a little bit more sophisticated than just thinking about, you know, whether algorithms and the tools of virality are, you know, are transparent or not, right? So the ABC framework really requires disaggregating all of these different elements, and I think would allow us to be a little bit more careful in terms of identifying both you know, the harmful content and the, as it was put, ideal content, which is a really, I hadn't thought about it in that way. It's a really great way of putting it. And I think that if you start to do that, you start to break down, okay, what are the tools that you can use against particular kinds of content. I think transparency is very much a part of this, but it's also very much a point of resistance by the companies. And so, I mean, and that's why the proposal is not just a suggestion of transparency. It is a kind of transparency with teeth. But I think at the end of the day, we do have to have very nuanced approaches to content, because what we'll end up seeing, and this really goes to Marietje's point about the potential for, differentiation between how democratic governments and authoritarian governments might use some of these concepts. Because a democratic government might be able to say, okay, there's the possibility of regulating this space with transparency tools, with tools to address the virality of intentionally, let's say, malicious or deceptive content, and to do it in a way that is governed by basic rule of law standards. But those same kinds of standards may not apply if we're talking about an authoritarian government that is going to use these distinctions between ideal and deceptive content in really a way that is only in their interest. So they will end up kind of cracking down on information that becomes, let's say, viral, that is really just criticism of government policy, which is fundamental to democratic governance, but it won't be applied that way by non-democratic governments. So it's a really good question. I don't have a really firm answer, except to say that we need to move to a place where there's much, much greater transparency at a more granular level, so that we can make these kinds of distinctions and then offer proposals to the companies that they pursue those certain kinds of outcomes in a way that is more directed towards the deceptive and not to the ideal.
Yeah, I mean, so the roadmap that we put out with Ellen Goodman gets at some of these same issues and tries as much as possible to stay away from the C and to focus on we call it practices. So I think there's and one of the things we suggest for the supervisory body is that it be about monitoring and forcing the release of that kind of data, so that so you can understand what happened with the practices. But one of the things I was going to move on from this, but one of the questions follows directly from what David just said, and is direct at Marietje. It says, Marietje mentioned the competing models emerging from China and Russia. What are the levers of influence that the transatlantic model has at its disposal in convincing more societies to follow our lead? And is it possible for American and European companies to play in both the democratic and authoritarian systems, or must they be forced to choose? And I want to get Susan in here too, because of your role with the transatlantic dialogue and how you're going to be fostering that going forward. But since it was directed at Marietje, if you want to start.
Yeah, I think tech companies have taken all the benefits from having grown in free societies, have very effectively lobbied against democratically inspired interventions and safeguards. It should be said that the reason why democratic governments have been so late and even distracted is also because of massive lobbying, also to civil society organizations and academia, revolving doors. So I think the real question of what democratic societies can do has been heavily influenced by the success that tech companies gained from the freedom in which they operated. And so I hope that comes with a little bit of a sense of owing back and responsibility. But what we're seeing now is none of that. We actually see that while a lot of the big tech platforms are lobbying against interventions from democratic governments, they are twisting and turning to stay accepted in authoritarian markets while making compromises to freedom of expression that they claim as their greatest goal. So I think that the only way in which the choices will be forced is by more transparency, also in understanding what these companies are already doing in authoritarian countries and what they're doing in our own societies, which is profit driven. Let's not kid ourselves. These are mostly advertising companies, not the holders of the mantle of freedom of expression. There may be some overlap in their business models and free expression, but the idea that they are the guardians of these values, I think, is misguided. So I believe that the success of European and American efforts greatly depends on a much broader question of success of democracy at large, which is under extraordinary pressure, the protection of universal human rights, which is under immense pressure. And so I'm therefore very sad and feel a great sense of urgency to act now after having lost so many years of a competitive advantage, of an innovative advantage that have been squandered. There has been no real responsibility taken by democratic governments to advance the international rules-based order for the digital world. And so I think whether democratic countries can succeed in developing a model that extends the international rules-based order online vis-a-vis authoritarian alternatives will be proven in the next couple of years. And I fear that a tipping point is already behind us. I hope I'm wrong.
Susan, what should we be doing as a transatlantic community to address these incredibly urgent issues, this contest that we're having?
Okay, first of all, I don't think all of the blame in the world should be on platforms. They certainly do have a responsibility to be good corporate citizens, and I think we're seeing more and more movement in that direction. I also would add in passing that oftentimes we will focus just on platforms, ignoring the fact that a lot of the disinformation, the venom, etc., is on broadcast media, is in newspapers and the like. It is not just an online issue. That having been said, a lot of our recommendations on transparency and accountability go to looking at not just the some of the algorithms, but also looking at the curation side of algorithms, having a much better understanding of what is being referred, what is being prioritized, and whether, once again, the platforms are actually delivering what they say that they are trying to deliver, and getting at that. And that would be part of the oversight process within our set of recommendations. I do think we need to be working together, not adversarially, but cooperatively on the research that needs to be done. And this can be done on a transatlantic basis, not necessarily just government to government, to understand and develop evidence. We assume a lot of things, but do we really know that that is in fact what is happening with people's use of platforms? And also empowering people to take greater responsibility or power or choice in what they do online. I would encourage, and we do encourage, greater choice in terms of, Marietje was talking about micro-targeting, having systems in which people can decide to what extent they want to have the micro-targeting in their systems and the like. I think there are technology approaches that can do a good job of addressing some of these issues. And I would strongly push to go in that direction. Because once again, if it's all on government to impose rules, by the time you get to that point, an awful lot of time has passed. I think we can work cooperatively with some of the platforms to better address these issues. And the transparency coupled with accountability is designed to get us more rapidly and hopefully in a more productive way towards a better outcome.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I want to give a chance for this really powerful panel to say whatever it is they didn't get a chance to say already. I'll just throw out another question. That there were two questions that both got at which companies are we aiming to have this framework apply to. Susan, you had said you wanted to protect entrepreneurship and smaller companies. Is there, though, a disincentive if there's a cliff people can't grow too far because then they become regulated. And another questioner asked, who are you thinking of applying this to? So if you want to work that into your final remarks, but we're, it's a shame to have to end this discussion now. These could not be more urgent issues. The three of you are such wonderful leaders on this and are communicating to the world how we have to think about this and how seriously we have to take it, and helping to lead the way. And we welcome the chance to continue to collaborate with all of you as we go forward on all of this. GMF Digital's values, I think, are very similar to what's expressed in this report. So Susan, do you want to continue and maybe start talking about the entrepreneurship?
Yeah, larger companies are obviously in a better position and have more influence across the globe. So most of the work would be focused on transparency by those companies. That having been said, what we've also seen happen is, to the extent that there's greater pressure brought to bear on these companies to take down hateful accounts and the like, those systems, such as the Reddit group, the Donald, end up moving to smaller platforms that either want to attract that kind of behavior, or alternatively, don't have the resources to be able to police it as well as the larger companies. So we recognize that there are some unintended consequences that are involved. Also, we think that the larger companies can provide greater assistance, guidance to some of the smaller companies to ensure that they are able to police their systems appropriately, and that is using some of the technology that already exists. We are concerned, however, that over-reliance on AI without human intervention will end up resulting in a lot more takedown of perfectly legal content than would otherwise happen. So we caution about that.
Great. David, you have any final thoughts for us?
Sure. Just very quickly, one, I do think that the core here for our focus should be on the super dominant companies that have massive power over public space. I don't think it will be that difficult to figure out ways to deal with the massive scale and the massive power of those companies, while also facilitating innovation by smaller companies. That's not rocket science, but we do know which companies have massive power and which, frankly, don't. So there needs to be an effort there. The other point that I would just make in closing is that, the last couple of weeks might give us all the sense that, the content problems are going to be resolved because, advertisers are pulling their dollars and euros from Facebook or YouTube. I would strongly counsel against taking that away, that being the takeaway from the last few weeks. I mean, I think it's important for advertisers to have a sense of responsibility in this space, but that's not going to be lasting without government and multi-stakeholder approaches like the ones in the Transatlantic Working Group in this report. And more than that, it's that kind of move, or those kinds of moves, are great when you agree with the outcomes, but they're not going to be great when you don't agree with the outcome. So there is simply no substitute for a real firm public policy, rooted in human rights standards and democratic principles, as opposed to simply saying, "Oh, the advertisers are finally getting it. We're done."
And Marietje, if you could close us out today.
Well, I fully agree with what David said, that while there is a huge momentum here, and I encourage people to build on that momentum, read our reports, see what they can work with, it is not enough to say, oh, well, it will be sorted out with advertisers voting with their feet or something like that, because these are very fundamental issues that also touch the heart of democracy and the rule of law. What we've tried to describe, I think, are a set of core issues, but they're not the only ones. And so to those asking the questions about the relationship between small companies and large companies, I can't help but think about antitrust, which is also a very dynamic field right now, which also deals with questions about, you know, when do small companies get acquired? What does that do to the competitive space and to choice for internet users and consumers if they wish to go to an alternative platform? How easy is it for them to then, you know, take their data and go elsewhere? So I feel like, partially fueled by the excessive power of big tech platforms, there's a broad discussion about what are the best ways to balance it back out in the interest of democracy and the rule of law. And so content moderation, freedom of expression are very important, but so is antitrust, so is non-discrimination, so is access to information and election integrity, many of which you at GMF with many of your esteemed colleagues are working on. And so I'm glad that we could have a bit of a discussion today. I hope we will have many more, and that there will be a preservation of a transatlantic space for leadership, which is also, I think, part of the goals that we had with our commission in these difficult times.
Thank you all very, very much. And thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.